Welcome to the third technique video in this series on adding beads to crochet. In this video, you'll see what happens when you add a loose bead in between stitches. I'll demonstrate the technique first, and then I'll discuss the pros and cons of doing it this way. So let's get started. I am in double crochet. I've worked my turning chains, so I'm essentially at the end of a stitch. I'm ready to start the next stitch, and I want to place a bead right there on that loop. My challenge is my hook does not fit through my bead, so I will need to swap out for a different hook. So I get a smaller hook, and I put the bead on the smaller hook, and I put the hook in the loop. Now, some people will say you pull the loop up through the bead, and some people will say you push the bead down over the loop. They are equivalent actions, so both answers are correct. So think of it whichever way makes sense to you. Now I will swap back for my original crochet hook, and then I'll work my stitch. I'm in double crochet, so I'll do that, but this could be single crochet, half double, double, treble, whatever you want. I don't have to do anything special when I work that stitch. You've already figured out, no doubt, that swapping hooks all the time is rather inefficient. If you can find a compatible bead and hook combination, you can load the beads onto the neck of the hook, and then you just slide the bead into position and work the next stitch. Now the downside, of course, is I am working this yarn with a hook that is not the size I would normally choose. So it's a little tricky, and you have to watch your tension, but if you can do it, this is a much more efficient way of doing this. So let's see what we got. One of the advantages is you have a lot more creative freedom. You don't have to plan ahead. You can improvise as you go. You can decide, wait, I don't want blue beads, I want orange beads. Let's use orange beads. Or you can put something in and go, oh, wait, that didn't turn out the way I wanted. And you can rip back. The beads will just come loose and fall off when you rip back. If you do that, maybe put a towel or a foam mat or a bowl or something underneath your project so you can catch the beads instead of them going everywhere. But if you want some creative freedom, and if you want a technique that is more forgiving of mistakes, this would be one of those. Also, you don't have to pull the yarn through hundreds of beads. So less abrasion on the yarn, less likely the yarn is going to weaken and fray. On the flip side of this technique is not really portable. You're going to have an open container of beads, and they tend to jostle around, and they might get spilled, and beads go everywhere. So I would not put this project in my bag and take it with me if this is the way I'm doing my beads. With this technique, I end up with a horizontal orientation for my bead rather than vertical. At least that's what I got in double crochet. In single crochet, I'm on an angle. But when I flip the work over, you see I do have reversibility. I like that. It looks good on both sides. The bead is held on with two strands because you have a loop going through the bead, and then you get this one little strand that goes around the bead. The biggest challenge with this technique is the beads sit up on the chain. When you work the next row, you have to decide, well, where is my next stitch going to be? Is it going to be on this side of the bead, or is it going to be on this side of the bead? So it can get kind of tricky. Where does my hook go? And I think how well that works depends a lot on your stitch pattern. I got lucky with this stitch pattern. When I pull it apart, you can see there's the bead, and I worked the double crochet here to the right. But in this pattern, it all kind of pushes together and the double crochets line up, and it's actually pretty good. But let me show you a swatch that was not entirely successful. On the bottom of this swatch, I worked a mesh. So it's a double crochet, put a bead in position, chain one, double crochet, bead in position, chain one, double crochet. And then on the next row, I worked the double crochet into the previous double crochet, so the posts line up. And that was pretty good. The only issue I have is you do get that little bit of yarn showing, you get that loop. When you have a contrast in color between the bead and the yarn, I think that's probably more annoying. If the bead and the yarn were similar in color or value, I think that would be less pronounced. But here's where you start to get into an issue. So what happens if I want to work into the chain? And you see here, this is where it starts to get a little wonky. And then I wanted to offset my chains. So on the next row, I tried to offset, and it just didn't go well. I'm not happy with it. On a different swatch, I tried working into that loop at the bottom, getting kind of behind it and underneath it and bringing it around. And it ended up pulling up and above the bead. I guess you could probably make a decorative stitch with it. Again, it wasn't super successful. I wasn't happy with it. And then I thought, well, what if I put two beads here? Then I could just go in between the beads and I would still have symmetry. So that's what I tried up here. What happens when you work into the chain is that that little loop becomes a bigger loop. So not really happy with that. However, when you work into the space, it cinches the whole thing together. So maybe there are situations where putting two beads on the loop could be a solution. I think this technique really shines when you use it on the last row of a project, because then you can have a beaded edge across the top, and that's really lovely. This also isn't a bad technique if you like to make loopy chain edges, where you chain a bunch and single crochet and chain a bunch and single crochet. Because again, the bead has two strands of yarn going through it. You do get one strand around the outside, but this is more bead dominant. You see more of the bead and less of the yarn. So there you are. I think this is a technique that works in some stitch patterns better than others. In the next video, we'll look at what happens when you add a loose bead in the middle of making the stitch rather than in between stitches. See you at the next video. Happy crochet!